This is another history revision video, this one on the Black Power movement. Black Power had its roots in the 19th century in the Back to Africa movements, in Marcus Garvey's separate black nationalist movements of the 1920s, and also the Black Muslim movement, or the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was founded in 1930 and led since 1934 by a guy called Elijah Poole. He changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. He claimed to be the prophet of Allah and the messenger of Islam. He rejected some of the spiritual beliefs of Orthodox Islam and claimed instead that Allah originally created all people black and that other races were created by an evil scientist called Yaqub. His last evil creation was the white race. Whites would rule the world for several thousand years before Allah returns and ends their supremacy. The Nation of Islam provided blacks with an alternative to the white man's Christian religion. It persuaded members to live a religious life. It increased black self-esteem. It kept black and white separate and encouraged blacks to improve their economic situation. Temples were set up in northern black ghettos such as Detroit, New York and Chicago. Malcolm X was the Nation of Islam's most famous spokesperson, and he attracted the attention and devotion of frustrated ghetto dwellers with his bitter attacks on white America. Elijah Muhammad attacked the turn the other cheek philosophy of Martin Luther King and Christianity. He advocated separatism and armed self-defense against white aggression. The Nation of Islam's most famous recruit of all was the boxer Muhammad Ali. Some of the Nation of Islam's solutions to black problems, such as a return to Africa and a separate black state in the Deep South, were unrealistic. The Nation of Islam derided Martin Luther King as an Uncle Tom, a fool who humiliatingly begged for access to a white-dominated world and urged non-violence. King, in return, described the Nation of Islam as a hate group. The Nation of Islam image suffered greatly from the departure of Malcolm X and his subsequent assassination by Nation of Islam members, and the publicised rampant materialism and hypocrisy amongst the movement's leadership, Elijah Muhammad being the worst culprit. And many people left the Nation of Islam for what became the Black Power movement. There were some positives to the Nation of Islam. Its membership grew. In 1960 they had 100,000 members, by 1969 250,000. And they did inspire many blacks with its emphasis on self-confidence, on racial pride and economic self-help. They created many businesses such as restaurants, bakeries, grocery stores. They expected converts to live a religious life and emphasised extramarital chastity, the rejection of alcohol, tobacco and flamboyant clothing. Although, as previously noted, Elijah Muhammad didn't always follow his own rules. One of the key symbols and spokesmen of the Nation of Islam and later of Black Power was Malcolm X. He aimed to improve the lives of black Americans, and his main methods were to advertise through sermons, speeches and writing, and encourage critical thinking on racial problems. Some people accused him, though, of encouraging racial hatred and violence. Malcolm X claimed that he put forward the extremist position in order to make Martin Luther King's demands more acceptable to the white population. "I'm here to remind the white man of the alternative to Dr. King," he said. He rightly drew attention to the dreadful condition of America's ghettos, and he became an icon and a role model for black youth. He inspired the new next generation of black leaders such as Snick Stokely Carmichael and Cause Floyd McKissick. And he was the first really prominent advocate of separatism and what subsequently became known as Black Power during the Civil Rights era. Let's have a quick look at what was going on in black ghettos. The great Civil Rights movement of 1954 to 64 did nothing at all to solve the problems of the ghettos of the North, the Midwest and the West. Ghetto life was soul-destroying. Housing was poor and amenities were few, and it was hard to break out of the cycle of poverty. Only 32% of black ghetto pupils finished high school, compared to 56% of white children. Ghetto schools didn't provide solid educational foundation for good jobs, so 46% of unemployed Americans were black. Chicago had between a 50 and a 70% black youth unemployment problem. The leaders of the black community disagreed about how to improve ghetto life. The NAACP worked through the law courts for integrated education, and they aimed that would provide better quality education for blacks. A. Philip Randolph encouraged unionisation and pressure on the federal government for equal pay and employment opportunities. Ghetto violence was frequently fuelled by a black reaction to what were perceived as oppressive police policies. Most white people were unwilling to help the ghettos. American Cold War anti-communism ensured that sympathy for the poor was often equated with sympathy for communist policies of economic equality. Whites also feared that black children might hold back white children if they were integrated into their schools and damage their employment prospects. Black entry into a white neighbourhood often caused property prices to plummet. White voters didn't want to pay extra taxes to end ghetto poverty, particularly after 1965 when the Vietnam War was already causing tax increases. In the 5 long hot summers of 1964 to 68, American ghettos erupted into riots. The first major race riot was in Watts, Los Angeles, in 1964. There were 34 deaths, 1,000 injuries, 3,500 arrests, and $40 million worth of damage. Riots gained national attention. There were 238 race riots in over 200 cities between 1964 and 68. Most notably, Newark in New Jersey in 1967, Detroit in Michigan in 1967, Oakland in California in 1965 and 66, Cleveland, Ohio in 66 and 68, and Chicago, Illinois in 1966 and 1968. Civil rights organisations tried to respond to ghetto frustration. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference went to Chicago in 1967 and initiated the Poor People's Campaign. CORE established freedom houses to provide information on education, employment, health and housing. Whitney Young's National Urban League launched a programme to develop economic self-help strategies in the ghettos. But none of this was enough. Younger black activists criticised the great Lord Martin Luther King and rejected his emphasis on the South and non-violence. They seemed to be contributing little to progress in the ghettos. And ghetto blacks perceived the civil rights movement to be unhelpful and ineffective. They looked more and more to new leaders like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, whose condoning of violence seemed a more appropriate response to white oppression than Martin Luther King's "Love Thine Enemy." In the mid to late 1960s, both SNCC and CORE became increasingly radical. In 1966, SNCC was impatient with what they considered to be the slow progress of blacks towards equality, and turned to a more militant leader, Stokely Carmichael. At CORE, James Farmer, the man who founded the organisation, was replaced by the more radical Floyd McKissick. In July 1966, the annual CORE convention in Baltimore, Maryland, endorsed Black Power and declared non-violence inappropriate if black people needed to defend themselves. In December 1966, you know what I'm saying. In December 1966, SNCC voted to expel whites. In 1967, the annual CORE convention excised the word multiracial from CORE's constitution, and by 1968, whites were also excluded from being members of CORE. Carmichael urged American blacks to ally with other black victims of white colonialist oppression in developing countries. And in May 1967, Carmichael was replaced by Henry Rapp Brown, who advocated armed self-defence. He urged blacks to take over white-owned stores in the ghettos, using violence if necessary. The term Black Power was first used by Stokely Carmichael at the Meredith March in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1966, and it meant different things to different people. For some black people, it meant black supremacy or revolution. Elijah Muhammad said, "Black power means the black people will rule the white people on earth, as the white people have ruled the black people for the last 6,000 years." In 1968 and 69, black car workers in Detroit thought black power meant a black working class revolution. They united in a black power union, the League of Revolutionary Workers. Roy Wilkins of NAACP felt black power supporters were racist and were no better than Hitler or the Ku Klux Klan. Martin Luther King was initially critical. When he put black and power together, he said, "It sounds like you're trying to say black domination." He called for striped power, black and white together, and called black power a slogan without a program. He later acknowledged its positive connotations. "I think black power is an attempt to develop pride. There's no doubt about the need for power. Black power means instilling within the Negro a sense of belonging, an appreciation of heritage, a racial pride. We must never be ashamed of being black." SNCC's Floyd McKissick said black power is not hatred, but political power, economic power, and a new self-image for Negroes. The New York Times said nobody knows what the phrase black power really means. Cleveland Sellers of SNCC said there was a deliberate attempt to make black power ambiguous, so that it meant everything to everybody. The conservative black Republican Nathan Wright proposed a black power capitalist movement. And in 1968, Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon said that black power meant more black ownership, for from this can flow the rest: black pride, black jobs, black opportunity, and yes, black power. Some, like the author Alex Haley, put the emphasis on black pride and black culture. Some blacks adopted Afro hairstyles and African garb. Black college students successfully agitated for the introduction of black studies programs in universities. I'm going to stop there and carry this on in the next video, which will look at the Black Panthers.